You think you know Viking raids, the ships, the fire, the screaming, but nobody talks about what happened after, when the axes stopped swinging and the smoke cleared, when they sorted through what remained. The women who survived that first brutal hour faced something that made death look merciful. What did Vikings do with the widows they captured? Why were some kept and others discarded like broken tools? The answer sits in slave market records, DNA studies, and grave goods that tell stories no saga dared write. If you value documented Viking and Norse-era history like this, subscribe. It's the best way to support our work. Also comment from which city you're hearing this from. This script is researched and factual, using sources from archaeological evidence and medieval chronicles. Now back to the story. The morning of June 8th, 793, changed everything. Lindisfarne's monastery bells rang for morning prayer. By noon, they rang for the dead. Norse ships had materialized from the North Sea mist like wolves from winter fog. The Northumbrian coast had never seen anything like it. Monks fled toward the mainland. Some made it. Most didn't. But the real story wasn't the monastery's gold or the illuminated manuscripts scattered in the mud. It was what happened to the women in the fishing villages nearby. 43 bodies were buried in a mass grave that archaeologists found in 1993. 31 were men and children. 12 were women between 15 and 45. Carbon dating puts them right at 793. The DNA tells a different story about what happened to the women who weren't in that pit. Vikings didn't raid to kill everyone. They raided to profit. Dead people don't work. Dead people don't reproduce. Dead people can't be sold in Dublin's slave markets for 20 silver dirhams each. The women who survived that first cut faced a sorting process more ruthless than any battlefield. Age mattered, health mattered. Pregnancy didn't help. Neither did children clinging to their skirts. The widows got divided into 3 groups the moment the killing stopped. Group 1, young women without children, healthy enough for the voyage back. Group 2, older women with skills, weaving, cooking, brewing, who could work immediately. Group 3, everyone else. The unmarked graves scattered around Lindisfarne Hold. Group 3. The other 2 got dragged to the ships. Archaeological evidence from Repton, Derbyshire, shows what happened next. The Vikings wintered there in 873 or 874. Local women's DNA shows up in Scandinavian populations by 900 AD. Not just scattered traces, concentrated. Bloodlines that prove systematic transportation of captured women back to Norway and Denmark. The widows weren't just slaves. They were breeding stock for a warrior culture that lost too many men to raids and feuds. But getting to the markets required survival first. The voyage from England to Dublin took 6 days in good weather, twice that in rough seas. The women got chained below deck in spaces barely 4 feet high. Ibn Rushd described similar conditions on Viking slave ships heading down Russian rivers. They load them like cargo, 40 to a ship, with barely room to lie down. The Osberg. Ship burial suggests each woman got 18 inches of deck space. Bodies don't compress. Physics doesn't care about profit margins. Half didn't make the crossing. Pregnancy was a death sentence on those ships. So was seasickness that lasted more than 3 days. The crews had no time for the weak, and no food to waste on mouths that couldn't work. Skeletal remains from shipwrecks off the Shetlands show evidence of malnutrition and trauma injuries consistent with brutal handling. Fresh widows fought back initially. Broken arm bones and skull fractures tell us how that went. The survivors faced worse than storms. Vikings had developed specific techniques for breaking resistance during transport. Sleep deprivation came first. Captives were kept awake in shifts to prevent coordinated escape attempts. Food rationing followed precise calculations. Just enough to keep them alive, never enough to maintain strength for rebellion. The ship crews rotated guard duties every 4 hours to prevent any bonds forming between captors and captives. Physical restraints evolved with experience. Early raids used simple rope bindings that allowed some movement. By 890 AD, specialized iron shackles appeared in grave goods and archaeological sites. These weren't crude chains. They were engineered devices with specific measurements. Ankle shackles allowed walking but prevented running. Wrist restraints permitted basic tasks while stopping weapon use. The craftsmanship rivals contemporary metalwork found in royal burials. The ones who reached Dublin faced the slave markets that made the city rich. Excavations at Wood Quay revealed a complex grading system for human cargo. Women got sorted by age, health, beauty, and specific skills. A young widow with weaving abilities brought 22 silver pieces in 841. An older woman, good with animals, fetched 8. The account books from Christ Church Cathedral list prices in precise detail because slaves were taxable property. Market day occurred every 9th day according to Irish law codes. The surviving ledgers from Christ Church show average daily sales of 47 people during peak season. Women comprised 60% of the inventory. The pricing structure reveals brutal economics. Fertile women under 25 commanded premium rates. Those over 35 sold at severe discounts unless they possessed rare skills like literacy or metalworking. Buyers came from across the Norse world. Icelandic settlers needed women for new colonies. Norwegian jarls sought concubines and household workers. Danish traders bought in bulk for resale in Baltic markets. The customer base was so reliable that Dublin merchants offered credit terms and seasonal pricing. Spring raids produced summer auctions with peak prices. Winter inventory sold at discounts. But Dublin was just the distribution center. The real destinations were scattered across the Norse world. Some went to Iceland as founding mothers for new settlements. Archaeological evidence shows mixed Celtic-Norse populations appearing by 900 AD. Others ended up in Norway and Denmark as concubines for jarls who needed heirs. A few reached as far as Constantinople through the river routes that connected Scandinavia to Byzantium. The journey to Iceland meant 3 weeks at sea in vessels designed for cargo, not passengers. The Nar ships that carried settlers held 60 people maximum. Women were packed in the forward hold with livestock and supplies. Seasickness, dysentery, and scurvy killed approximately 30% before landfall. The survivors faced an island with no established infrastructure and winters that killed even experienced Norse colonists. Those shipped to Norway found themselves in established households with existing wives and concubines. The social hierarchy was rigid and enforced through violence. Celtic women entered at the bottom, below even long-established slaves. They slept in the coldest parts of longhouses, ate after everyone else, and performed the most dangerous tasks, like tending fires and processing fish in freezing weather. The lucky ones adapted. They learned Norse, had children, gained some protection through motherhood. Grave goods from 10th century Norway show Celtic brooches mixed with Scandinavian. Jewelry, evidence of women who kept some identity while building new lives. The unlucky ones left no trace except DNA markers and occasional references in sagas to the Irish woman who jumped from the cliff. If you value documented Viking and Norse-era history like this, subscribe. It's the best way to support our work. Also comment from which city you're hearing this from. The system worked too well to ignore. By 850 AD, raiding widows had become standard Viking practice. The monasteries got the attention because monks wrote the chronicles, but fishing villages, farming settlements, and trading posts bore the real cost. Women disappeared from coastal communities across Ireland, Scotland, and northern England. Population genetics shows the demographic impact lasted centuries. The raids followed a pattern that archaeologists can track through burned layer evidence. Spring raids hit during planting season when men were in the fields. The attackers knew exactly when to strike for maximum impact and minimum resistance. They'd studied the targets for months through trading contacts and advanced scouts. Nothing about these operations was random or spontaneous. Intelligence gathering began years before actual raids. Norse merchants visited target communities during regular trading seasons, mapping defenses and identifying valuable individuals. They noted which women had skills, which had noble blood, which had young children that would complicate transport. Local collaborators, often desperate men in debt, provided detailed information about family structures and seasonal routines. The sorting process got refined with each raid. Vikings learned that trauma made some women unusable for months. Others adapted quickly to captivity and became valuable interpreters and cultural guides for future raids on their home regions. The most prized captives were noble women who could be ransomed back to families or married off to create political alliances. A mass grave discovered in 2009 near Cork contains 46 bodies from a raid in 847 AD. The women buried there show signs of systematic execution, single-axe blows to the back of the skull. These were the rejects, the ones deemed too old, too sick, or too difficult to transport profitably. The positioning suggests they were forced to kneel in rows while crews decided their fate based purely on market calculations. Execution methods varied by region and practicality. In coastal areas, drowning was common. Bodies disappeared with the tide, leaving no evidence. Inland raids favored mass graves that could be covered quickly. Some sites show evidence of ritual elements, suggesting captives were sacrificed to Norse gods before departure. The practical and religious aspects merged into efficient killing systems. The DNA evidence tells us something darker. Many of the women who survived and reproduced show genetic markers for Stockholm Syndrome-like adaptation. They didn't just survive captivity, they thrived within it enough to have multiple children and live to old age in Norse settlements. The psychological mechanisms that allowed this adaptation were documented by Ahmad ibn Fadlan, who observed Viking communities along the Volga in 922 AD. Ibn Fadlan's account describes women who had clearly been captured but now held positions of authority within their captive communities. They supervised other slaves, managed household economies, and even participated in religious ceremonies. The transformation from victim to collaborator occurred within 2 to 3 years for most survivors. Those who couldn't adapt were killed or abandoned. Some became powerful figures in their adoptive societies. Aud the Deep-Minded was originally a Celtic captive who became a wealthy settler in Iceland. Her story appears in Laxdæla saga as proof that captured women could rise to prominence. But for every Aud, hundreds of nameless widows lived and died as property with no saga to preserve their stories. The trade routes that carried these women stretched from Greenland to Constantinople. Viking expansion wasn't just about land and plunder. It was about population replacement in territories where warfare had created gender imbalances. The systematic capture of reproductive age women from Celtic and Anglo-Saxon communities served as a demographic weapon that changed the genetic makeup of entire regions. Eastern routes were particularly lucrative. Women transported down the Dnieper River reached Byzantine markets where they commanded higher prices than in Dublin. The journey took months and killed many, but survivors could be sold for 40 gold solidi each, enough to buy a fully equipped warship. The economics justified the risks and brutality. Recent excavations at Lens aux Meadows in Newfoundland found evidence of Celtic women among the Norse settlers. These weren't voluntary immigrants. They were transported across the Atlantic as part of the earliest European colonization of North America. Their presence at the edge of the known world shows how far the widow trade extended. The Newfoundland women came from specific regions in Ireland and Scotland based on isotope analysis of their teeth. They were selected for particular skills: textile, production, food preservation, and child-rearing. The colony's survival depended on their expertise in areas where Norse knowledge was inadequate. Their captivity became essential to European settlement in North America. The practice didn't end with the Viking Age. It evolved into more sophisticated forms of human trafficking that persisted well into the medieval period. The legal codes that developed in Iceland and Norway during the 10th and 11th centuries included detailed regulations for the treatment of captured women, not to protect them, but to prevent conflicts between owners. Gragas, Iceland's early law code, specified exactly which rights captured women retained and which they lost. They could own small personal items but not land. They could choose religious practices but not refuse work assignments. They could marry with owner consent but not divorce without permission. The laws treated them as valuable livestock with limited agency. The archaeological record preserves the infrastructure that made this trade possible. Slave processing centers in Dublin, York, and Hedeby, holding facilities where captives waited for ships. Even the specialized shackles designed for long-distance transport. The logistics were as sophisticated as any other Viking enterprise. Hedeby's slave market occupied a dedicated section of the town, with permanent stone buildings for holding captives and conducting auctions. Archaeological excavations revealed drainage systems for waste management, cooking facilities sized for hundreds of people, and sleeping quarters designed to maximize capacity while preventing escapes. The investment in infrastructure shows how profitable the trade had become. A recently discovered hoard near Cordale contains 8,600 silver coins and 1,000 pieces of hacked silver dated to around 905 AD. Mixed in with the treasure were 15 iron slave collars, each inscribed with Norse runes indicating ownership and destination. The hoard represents the profits from years of systematic widow trading converted into portable wealth. The runic inscriptions on the collars name specific owners and destinations across Scandinavia. 3 were bound for Iceland, 5 for Norway, 7 for Denmark. The precision of the record-keeping shows how organized and businesslike the trade had become. These weren't impulsive raiders grabbing random captives. They were professional slavers, filling specific orders. The genetic evidence reaches its peak in Iceland, where 80% of the founding female population shows Celtic markers. This wasn't gradual cultural mixing. It was the result of concentrated importation of captured women during the settlement period between 870 and 930 AD. The Icelandic sagas that celebrate Viking exploration rest on a foundation of systematic sexual slavery that the same sagas never mention. Modern Icelanders carry the genetic legacy of this forced migration in their DNA. Mitochondrial markers trace directly to specific regions of Ireland and Scotland that were repeatedly raided during the settlement period. The women who founded Iceland weren't pioneers. They were prisoners whose children became the ancestors of a nation. But the widows weren't passive victims in every case. Some used their positions to gain influence and protect other captives. Others preserved and transmitted cultural knowledge that would have been lost otherwise. The Celtic elements that appear in later Norse art, music, and storytelling often trace back to captured women who became cultural bridges between societies. Textile, patterns found in 10th century Scandinavian graves, show clear Celtic influences that entered through captured craftswomen. Interlaced designs, color combinations, and weaving techniques spread throughout Norse settlements as enslaved women shared their skills. The artistic fusion that defines later Viking Age material culture often originated in the workshops where captured women labored. The trade created its own dark economics. A healthy young widow was worth approximately the same as 12 milk cows or one trained warhorse. The price calculations appear in multiple sources, including the legal codes that set compensation rates for stolen slaves. These weren't people to their captors. They were inventory with fluctuating market values. Seasonal variations affected pricing significantly. Spring captives, taken during planting raids, brought premium prices because they were fresh and healthy. Summer inventory, often held for months in poor conditions, sold at discounts. Winter auctions featured mostly damaged goods, women who had survived captivity but bore visible marks of their ordeal. The last documented widow raid occurred in 1066, when Harold Hardrada hit the Yorkshire coast before marching towards Stamford Bridge. The old system died with him in that battle, but its demographic impact shaped northern Europe for generations. Modern genetic studies can still trace the bloodlines that originated in those brutal markets and forced migrations. Harold's final raid netted 63 women, according to the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. They were loaded onto ships that never returned to Norway after Stamford Bridge. The women either died in the battle's aftermath or were sold in English markets to recover losses. Their fate represents the end of an era that had lasted 3 centuries. A mass grave uncovered in 2019 beneath a Dublin car park contained 79 bodies, including 23 women with clear trauma evidence from systematic violence. Carbon dating places them at 902 AD, the year Dublin's slave markets reached peak capacity according to Irish chronicles. The women were buried with their hands still bound, their stories reduced to bone and circumstance. But one wore a small silver cross hidden beneath her clothing, Celtic Christian symbols smuggled through months of captivity, preserving identity that no market could price or saga could erase. The cross bears an inscription in Latin, Mater Dolorosa, Mother of Sorrows. The woman who wore it kept faith through hell, hiding her beliefs beneath the skin where no slaver could reach. Her bones tell the story of systematic violence, but her cross tells the story of systematic resistance. In the end, the widows who survived that darkness didn't just build new worlds from their chains, they made sure those worlds remembered where they came from.